this session, Gene will be talking to us about mitigating TOCTOU in hybrid remote attestation, or in other words, remote attestation with TOCTOU avoidance. So over to you, Gene.
All right. Thank you very much, Rafael. This work, just to give credit where credit is due, is done by myself in collaboration with 2 former and 1 current PhD student. And you can see where the 2 former students went, and 1 is still with me for another year. And this recently appeared at the ACM CCS a month ago or so. So this is, I'll skip this slide because it's just about my lab. So yeah, like all talks, there should be an outline. And here we have a very generic outline of this talk. I just included because every talk should have one. So without further ado, this talk is in the context of IoT devices. In particular, these things that are kind of at the edge of the IoT, modern IoT ecosystem, or I'll refer to them as low-end IoT devices, but sometimes they're referred to as embedded systems, sometimes cyber-physical systems, or just intelligent gadgets of some sort. And as we all know, these things are increasingly surrounding us in many spheres of everyday life. In our homes, in our offices, in public spaces, various venues, in hotels and airports and planes and automobiles. They're increasingly surrounding us, and we are increasingly dependent upon them. Because most of them, some are frivolous and not very useful, but many of them serve a purpose. And many of them actually serve a single purpose, like the intelligent light switch, or an intelligent faucet, or a smart refrigerator, et cetera, et cetera. Now, they come in all shapes and sizes. What unifies these devices is the fact that they are not general purpose computers. So everything that is not a general purpose computer, that is not a desktop, a server, a laptop, or a smartphone, or a tablet, is essentially one of those things here. And of course, as these things begin to proliferate, and they began proliferating about, I don't know, 15 years ago, so did the attacks upon them. And if you've ever heard of an IoT gadget that has not been attacked, it's only because maybe you don't know, or it just hasn't happened yet. It hasn't become popular with the attackers. And so it's not a question of if a particular type of gadget will be attacked and compromised, but when. And so if you want to be a little bit scared, and I don't mean this in a frivolous way, there's an interesting book that was published earlier this year called "This is How They Tell Me the World Ends" by one of those award-winning journalist types, Nicole Perlroth. And if you search your favorite search engine, you will find it, and it's a very interesting read, actually done very, very well. Of course, we all heard of things like Stuxnet and DuQ and Mirai botnet, and those are just the more famous attacks on the IoT devices. But they are basically a kind of a preview of things to come. Now, as I said, these are ubiquitous, increasingly diverse, and their numbers are growing. They typically perform one of like 2 or 3 things. Some are sensors. They sense the environment. They report upon what they sense. Some are actuators, like a light switch, okay, or a smart wall plug. And some are hybrids of sensors and actuators, like, for example, a smoke detector will sense CO2 or smoke and then actuate by ringing an alarm. Some are purely control units, but most are sensors, actuators, or hybrids. Typically, the simple devices are at the edge, and then they're generally controlled by a more intelligent life form, something like a hub or concentrator or a router, or even the owner's smartphone. And of course, as I said, they are becoming very attractive targets for attacks and malware exploits. And we've heard, of course, I mentioned already the more famous examples. But let's focus for a second on what are the targets of these attacks, just to understand the environment a little better. The attacks generally focus on one of three things: privacy, security and safety, or zombification. And privacy is generally an attack on a sensor, right? So if a sensor is infected with malware, there's some kind of an exploit, then the adversary gets to learn what is being sensed. And that could be extremely intrusive, very privacy detrimental, et cetera, considering that these sensors can be located in all kinds of private spaces. And these sensors include things like cameras and motion detectors and all kinds of other sensing devices. Now, attacks on security and safety are generally attacks on actuators. So example would be attacking some kind of a smart factory and stopping all the machinery, or over-rotating some kind of a turbine that is being controlled by an intelligent controller, which is what happened with the Stuxnet case, or turning all the smart switches, all the smart light switches in a building and causing chaos, let's say, when it's dark outside. So those are attacks on security and safety. Zombification is an interesting third point of attack, and that is exactly what happened with the Mirai botnet, and probably will happen again and again in the future. So the idea is that the malware itself does not target the actuation capability. It does not target the sensing capability of a device it infects, but rather it wants to deposit a payload that will be later used for some nefarious purpose. So it could be mining Bitcoin, or it could be mounting a distributed denial of service attack. And so this is essentially what I call zombification. And if you know anything about Mirai botnet of several years ago, that's precisely what it did. It infected a huge number of the off-the-shelf DVR cameras, and deposited the payload and waited for a command from the command and control center to mount a large-scale DDoS attack on a selected target. So this is the landscape of attacks, generally speaking. Now we're going to focus on this talk, and I'm sorry, I will not be able to, if there are any questions, I think I will not be able to answer them during the talk, so I'll wait till the end, because I see there's something in chat. So the low-end IoT gadgets are the ones we're going to focus on in this talk. And those are I call them kind of the amoebas of the IoT world. They are the simple, like single-cell organisms. And of course, they are the cheapest and the most numerous, right? Because they generally are computationally weak, or as weak as it gets. They generally lack the trappings of more developed systems. They don't have operating systems, they don't have hypervisors, they don't have support for virtual memory, meaning there's no MMU, or memory management unit, there's no memory protection unit. So there's no way to partition memory into different protected zones. So there's no trusted computing features like a TE of the kind we are used to having in our phones and laptops. So in other words, very much a bare bones environment. And so typically a thing like a smoke detector or GPS sensor or a smart light switch or a smart door lock might have, or a motion detector might have something like this, which still is an IoT device, but its intelligence is highly limited or very minimal. Right? And such things why are they small and cheap? Well, because they're supposed to take very little space or very little volume. There's sort of these physical constraints. There's a cost constraint because the manufacturers want to sell them in large quantities. And there are severe pressures on keeping the budgets low. They often have low power requirements, or at least requirements to minimize power consumption, et cetera, et cetera. So security typically takes very much a background role here in these devices. And to give you a more concrete example of the kind of an MCU or microcontroller unit that will run this kind of an edge IoT gadget, something like a Texas Instruments MSP430 or AVR at Mega, or otherwise known as Arduino, would be good examples of those kinds of devices. So if we zoom in on TI MSP430, which is and has been around for quite some time, that kind of a device has like 64 kilobytes of memory, of course, just one CPU, single core, running somewhere between 8 and 16 megahertz, and basically on a typically 8-bit processor, maybe a 16-bit processor. Okay, so this should give you an idea of the kind of low form of life we're dealing with here. So how do we secure these tiny devices, or these rather MCUs, from malware? Because rest assured, they can and they have been already subject to successful malware attacks. So at the same time that these devices can, I just told you that there are these poor little things that have no security features to speak of, they still are deployed in many cases in environments where they perform safety or security critical tasks like motion detectors, or smoke detectors, CO2 detectors, I don't know, maybe radiation detectors, but definitely all kinds of detectors and sensors that perform safety critical tasks. And so preventing attacks on these devices is the best thing we could do. Prevention is always better than detection, especially when it comes to safety critical function. However, it doesn't take too long to think about this problem and realize that on such resource poor hardware, prevention is just not viable, because these devices cannot run sophisticated anti-malware software, right? That is periodically, or sometimes very often, updated with the latest malware fingerprints. They cannot perform fancy crypto. We tried, in fact, just as an exercise, to get one of those MSP430s to just to verify an RSA, a relatively weak RSA signature, and even that was not possible. There's simply not enough memory. So crypto, malware, verification of certificates, forget it. None of these functionalities that are totally normal in a general purpose computing world can be afforded here. So the next best thing we can do is detection. And that's really the only choice we have. If we can't prevent malware from getting in, then at least we can detect and do something about it. And so the alternative to prevention, or in other words, the one way to detect malware, is to do what's called the remote attestation. And let's turn to that topic for a second. What is remote attestation? So I'm sure some of you have heard about it, but this being a CANS being a mostly crypto-oriented conference, maybe not everybody has heard about it. So basically, it's a very simple concept that involves two parties, a prover and a verifier, just like many crypto settings or security protocol settings. And the verifier is going to be a trusted party, and the prover is going to be the untrusted, remote, low-end device that may be compromised or infected with malware. And so the idea is that verifier wants to check, probably periodically or in some schedule, the health of its constituent prover. And it may have a multitude of provers that it's under it. So it wants to verify, right? What is the state of the prover? Is it in a healthy state, or is it in some kind of a compromised state? So it issues a challenge, and the prover is supposed to look at its memory and compose, based on that challenge, some kind of an authenticated measurement. Typically, think of your favorite MAC function, basically an HMAC or something like that. Some secure measurement of its current state, and based on the challenge, and then respond with that result. The verifier receives the result, verifies it, decides the outcome. Right, and now, and maybe if the outcome is negative, meaning there's something wrong, then the verifier would take some corrective action, which we do not show here. But so if the idea is then if everything is okay, the verifier is happy, and if there's some malware, even tiny as possible malware, it's sitting somewhere that infected the prover, that authenticated measurement would capture the fact that malware is present, right? Because memory would have been modified. And then verifier would learn it, right? So that's the basic idea. And if it seems to you awfully trivial, well, it is pretty trivial. It is essentially something you learn in the Security 101 in the first course. It's a kind of an entity authentication challenge-based. The only difference here is that the prover doesn't just authenticate itself, it computes this authentication token based not only just on the challenge, but also its own memory content. But that's the only twist. And the concept of remote attestation, perhaps in some different flavors, I just don't have the time to get into it at the moment, goes back to late 90s, maybe even earlier. And its first incarnations were in the context of secure boot for general purpose computing systems, then through TPM, already incorporated the concept of remote attestation. And so do modern TEs like ARM Trust Zone and Intel SGX. But when they use the term remote attestation, they mean something a little different, something a little bit more involved. So the way that I explain remote attestation is like the simplest, most bare bones concept thereof. And in the context of these low-end devices, where remote attestation is pretty much like I described, there have been a number of schemes proposed, and I list a few here. Some of them are from my group, some of them are from Darmstadt, which is also TU Darmstadt, which is very active in this area. Some are from KUL Leuven, and there are a few others. This is not an exhaustive list, but basically all of them adhere more or less to this protocol, and they vary in terms of the assumptions and hardware, software modifications for devices. So if we have such a service that we call remote attestation, is that actually enough, right? The next question is, can we detect malware all the time, right? If the malware is there or has been there, can we detect it? And so the next question is, well, if the malware is on the device, then coming back to this picture for a second, we can definitely detect it. But what if the malware is not on the device when remote attestation is performed? That is, if remote attestation is performed in time T1 and everything is okay, and then it again performed at time T2 and everything is okay, but in between T1 and T2, there may be a considerable time, depending on the schedule or regime of attestation, but there may be some considerable time in between when malware could have infected the device, done it nefarious work, and left. And we call this migratory or transient malware, and such malware has been quite viable, and it exists in the wild. In fact, that's a smart malware, has all the motivation in the world to operate in this fashion, right? It does not want to be detected, because as soon as it's detected, corrective action will be taken and it will be expunged, hopefully. But malware remains unseen, right? Stealthy, if it manages to infect, perform its tasks, and erase its all traces of its presence before the next attestation. And so this is the big question in the context of this talk. How do we detect the fact that malware has been there but is no longer there? Now, remote attestation, the way I described it, is a static function, right? It tells you what is there right now. It doesn't tell you what is on the device 2 seconds from now or what was on the device 30 minutes ago. It just tells you what is there right now. So it cannot, by definition, detect presence of this migratory transient malware, because the device simply does not retain information about there having been malware. It's also, by the way, remote attestation, again, if we look at this simple picture of the protocol, this generic protocol, it looks really, really simple, and it really actually is kind of simple. The protocol that is simple. But what is not perhaps altogether obvious is that the prover has to compute the cryptographic function of its entire memory, right? Its entire, well, writable memory, RAM. And that, even if the function itself is fairly efficient, like an HMAC or some kind of a AES-based, counter-based Mac, that function is not negligible. For a very slow device, for a very tiny, anemic device with 8-bit processor, to compute an HMAC of 64 kilobits takes seconds. We've measured it, and you might think, well, what's a few seconds? But actually consider that this device may be performing a safety or security critical task. And so if it's taken out of commission by having to compute a response to remote attestation, it cannot do its main task, its day job, which is to perform the critical function it is supposed to perform. So attestation and similar security services are themselves a kind of a denial of service for the device itself. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that if we perform remote attestation, we are actually taking the device while it's performing that, computing that token, we're taking it out of commission for that period of time. So it hinders the performance of the main tasks of the device. And this motivates our approach, which we call TOCTOU-Secure array. Now, what is TOCTOU? TOCTOU is time of check to time of use. Most of us are computer scientists, we're used to these kind of tortured acronyms, and this is one of them, but at least it's pronounceable. It goes back perhaps decades to the 90s and maybe even late 80s. It's not specific to security, and it's not specific to remote attestation, clearly. And you may have heard of this, of the TOCTOU phenomenon in a different guise. Basically, it's a race condition, right? The most generic way to describe it is it's a race condition that occurs when there is a time gap between checking the state of a system and using the results of that check. Okay, so in particular, in the context of, let's say, sensing, or you have a IoT sensor, and what would be an example here? So you perform an attestation, a remote attestation of a sensing device, and conclude that everything is okay. And then you decide to actually use the device by asking it to sense something. But notice that these are two different operations, checking and using. And they are not fully coupled. They are not atomic. So the TOCTOU attack, or the TOCTOU, occurs here in the interval between checking and using. Okay? So if every time we wanted to use, we would check, that would be also extremely wasteful, right? Because it would require the device to compute this fairly expensive function. Anyway, as I said, this is not unique to the TOCTOU, to the remote attestation context, right? And this is basically the illustration of what I just described, right? Because in the time between the successful, seemingly successful check and the use of the resource, in this case, a sensor, malware could have come in and made itself at home, right? And this is exactly the kind of malware that erases itself, like before the device is checked, and reinfects it after the check is done, so that when somebody actually tries to use the device, it is already infected or reinfected, as it may be. Okay, so coming back to the original problem, we have this notion of remote attestation, which is very helpful, but is static. And so if we look at a timeline, right, of let's say, successive remote attestation, assuming for a moment that attestation is performed at regular intervals, it doesn't, of course, have to be, it can be performed on any even random schedule, but it's easier to illustrate it if it's performed on a regular intervals. The problem is that these so-called vulnerability windows that you see, the periods between successive attestations of the device, this is when malware can come in, do its deeds and leave. And so one natural way, of course, is to increase the frequency of attestation and say, let's maybe try to reduce the size of those time windows when malware can come in. And if we had some idea of how long it takes for malware to come in, introduce itself onto the device, how long it takes for malware to do its dirty deeds and leave, then we could perform attestation in an interval of time smaller than that. But first problem is we don't know how long malware it takes to settle into the device and perform its whatever deeds it wants to perform and leave. And second, even if we could do that, we would wind up mounting a denial of service attacks on ourselves, right? Because we would have to perform remote attestation so often that the device would be frequently out of commission for as far as its real job and real purpose. So that's a problem. And so our goal in this work is to attain what we call TOCTOU-Secure RA, or TOCTOU-Secure a remote attestation that guarantees that memory on the prover device is monitored and all modifications are recorded, not prevented, recorded, noted. And whenever remote attestation takes place, the prover tells the verifier nothing changed or something changed since the last time you performed remote attestation. That's essentially the goal, right? And that can be done very cheaply, and it can, as you will see in a few minutes, greatly reduces the overhead of remote attestation. Now let's step back for a second. Before we go on with a fairly, what I warned you already was going to be a very simple design, we can step back and ask a few kind of devil's advocate type questions. First of all, you notice I talk about like the low-end devices. Again, these amoebas of the IoT world. And so the question, natural question is, are these devices here to stay? Are they going to be here 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Are we going to have these kinds of edge devices that are simply incapable of like hosting an operating system or a hypervisor or running a trusted execution environment, like an ARM trust zone or some micro version thereof? And the answer, my answer to that question is yes. There will always be pressure to produce cheaper, smaller, less power hungry, less resource hungry devices that it can manufacturers will always want to flood the market with. And even those devices will be subject to malware attacks, just like they are today. So my firm belief, though I cannot formally prove it, is that the answer to this question, they are here to stay. And so we have to budget and we have to plan for securing these devices into the future. Right? So if you think about, well, let's take a TE today, like something, a very small, like a trust zone M, right? That this is the scaled down version of ARM trust zone. Well, first of all, the amount of power that that thing requires is going to probably double, if not triple, the power requirements of a TI MSP 430 or at Mega AVI. The real estate that it takes, the actual physical space that it takes is non-trivial either. It's likely to also double the weight and the size of the device when you place a TE on it. It also would require other components, other secondary components like a special bus, and that's not free. Plus there's the cost factor. Introducing a TE can easily multiply the cost of the device by some non-trivial number. Okay, multiply, not add. Okay, so the answer to this question from my side is definitely they are here to stay. The second question is, why do we bother with this notion of remote attestation? Wouldn't it be interesting if we just considered these devices, yeah, these devices are here to stay, they're going to be sold very cheaply in very large numbers, and they cannot really accommodate any security features because security budgets are very low in dollars and cents. So aren't these devices going to be like throwaway types, disposable? We're going to install them, and then a few months, maybe a year later, we're going to see newer ones on the market, and we're going to throw away the old ones, and we're going to start using the new ones, and that's it. And in this case, why do we need to bother with all this stuff? Can't we just hard code everything and essentially create what's called ASIC, right? put all, instead of any kind of software that these devices run today, we make them all hardware, right? ASIC, application-specific integrated circuits. And essentially, they're static. Once they are sold or released or produced, there's no software update. There's no firmware reflashing. They're done. And so when they outlive their usefulness, you throw them away. The truth is, this may be the case for some devices. For some consumer gadgets, this may be the case, that software updates may be avoided. And if that's so, then we never need to deal with remote attestation or any kind of malware infestations, because well, most types of malware is not capable of penetrating pure hardware. But there will always be these devices that are installed in very large numbers in offices, in buildings, in factories, in public spaces that are simply logistically are impossible or are not viable to replace every year or every 6 months. They're going to have to be installed inside walls and inside concrete and inside under the floors and all kinds of other places where they're going to have to be relatively long-lived and yet deployed in large quantities and at low price. So my answer to this is these devices, some of them may have a short lifespan and they don't need security because everything can be fixed in hardware, but many others will still need to be updated. And this is the root of the problem. If a device ever needs to be updated, that means there has to be some software on it, right? Something that can be replaced. And if it can be replaced, then malware can replace it or modify it. And so that's the answer here. And as I said, we could also try to minimize these vulnerability windows that I discussed in the previous slide, but that, of course, is basically like shooting yourself in the foot. So, moving right along, the next step is the presentation of RATA, or Remote Attestation with TOCTOU Avoidance. And it comes in two flavors, RATA A and RATA B. And the first one is just a kind of a toy example. It's not really all that practical. You'll see in a minute why. And the second one is more serious. It is the one that aimed at the actual realistic low-end IoT devices. Now, so RATA A, the first variant, is implementing this or attaining this TOCTOU-Secure array, assuming the device, the underlying device, has what's called a secure clock. Now, I tell you right away that this is very unlikely, but it is something to start with. Okay, so bear with me. So the idea is very simple, like exceedingly simple. We assume that the device, this is the prover we're talking about, that the device being measured, has a very small reserve buffer. We call it LMT, or latest modification time. Okay, and that buffer could be something like 32 to 64 bits long. So it's fixed length. And its exact bit size depends on the granularity of the clock. Okay, so we assume there is a secure clock we call RTC, or reliable real-time clock. Okay, and the idea is that RATA monitors all the write operations to the attested memory region. Right, so we assume that in the memory of the device, of the prover device, there is a region, maybe the entire memory, which is subject to attestation, where a malware could possibly hide or insert itself. And so the point of RATA A is to monitor all write operations to that memory region, okay? And whenever a write operation occurs, RATA does not ask, is it legitimate write operation? Is it not legitimate? Who is doing it? Doesn't ask these questions. It merely says, whenever there is any kind of write, it sets a 1-bit signal in hardware that causes this LMT field to be updated with the current clock. Okay, so as soon as it detects a write in anywhere in the attested memory region, a clock read is triggered and the clock value is deposited into or copied into this LMT. Okay, so you probably see where I'm going with this. So LMT is guaranteed to faithfully record the latest modification time of memory. Legitimate or illegitimate doesn't matter. The latest modification time is always there. Now, the clock is assumed to be reliable, secure, right? So no one can mess with the clock. It's monotonically ticking upwards, right? As good clock should be, right? But the only other missing thing is, what about this LMT itself, that actual reserved field? And so RATA also monitors attempted writes to the LMT. And if anyone, any software tries to write to LMT, it resets the device before the write actually occurs. Okay, so this is a very simple operation. And basically any malware that is potentially resident on that prover, it is by definition software, right? So when it tries to play around and modify the LMT, the device resets immediately. So essentially malware is incapable of modifying LMT, or no software can modify. Well, so one of our goals, not just in this work, but in the previous work that I don't have time to describe today, has been to achieve these designs or schemes, to design these schemes for remote attestation and related things with some assurance in mind. And so we always had the secondary goal, besides designing the actual technique, is to make sure that it's at least somewhat viable and it has offers some kind of a concrete guarantees. And in this case, we also follow this goal, or we go towards this goal with the aim of formally verifying the design. And so in order to do so, we take several steps, including formally specifying the properties in linear temporal logic. Okay, and so this is just an example of the LTL, linear temporal logical LTL statements that we come up with for this very simple RATA A design, right? If you know LTL, these are very, very trivial. Okay, and there's a state machine that also has to be specified as part of the verification pipeline. And essentially, what I already described is the analog of this finite state machine. Now, in interest of time, I'm going to try to speed up here a little bit because there's still a bit left to cover. But of course, as I said earlier, RATA A is basically a kind of a strawman design. It isn't realistic because most IoT devices don't have secure clocks, and least of all low-end tiny IoT devices. There's no way to, because a secure clock essentially is a kind of a tiny piece of secure hardware, and not only does it cost non-trivial amount, but it also requires a battery backup and all other sort of sundry things that come with that. So it isn't realistic to assume the presence of a reliable secure clock on a low-end IoT device. So, but RATA A does give us a blueprint of how to do things or what to strive for without clocks. And so with a couple of little tricks, we produce RATA B, which is also TOCTOU-Secure array, but now without the assumption of a secure clock. So here's the main trick, or the main observation here. Without a reliable clock reading, what RATA B does is it emulates having a clock by using the time or the clock from the verifier. Because remember, the verifier is a trusted party, which is remote, and it's going to at some point try to query the prover and see if the prover is in good state or not. So the verifier is going to compose, whenever it wants to challenge the prover, it's going to use its local clock reading, which we assume is reliable, secure, etc., because verifier is a trusted and much more powerful device. It's going to use its clock reading as its current clock reading as a challenge. And so when the verifier, when the prover receives that request to perform attestation, it will find the challenge, but it would also authenticate the challenge. Okay, so it's very important the prover must authenticate the challenge, and it uses that challenge after it's authenticated as prover's own time. So it says, I trust the verifier, and now I'm going to use it as its time as my own time. And the rest of the design is more or less as what you've seen with RATA A, except, and this might sound a little bit non-trivial, that the first authenticated attestation after someone modified the attested region always triggers an update of this LMT, last modification time, with the new challenge of the verifier. And that essentially enables detection of potential writes to the attested region in the interim. Okay? Essentially achieving the same thing that RATA-A did with a secure clock. And this requires as well some LTL statements, a little more involved than the ones you saw with RATA-A. I'm not going to go into those in detail, but I refer you to the paper. And of course, I'm happy to make these PowerPoint slides available. But as you can see here, without a clock, the finite state machine is quite a bit more involved. Now, just to give you the idea of these states, the not mod state means that nobody has modified the attested region. Okay, a test state means that the attestation is being performed. Okay, the update state means that LNT is being updated. Mod state means that somebody modified the attested region, and of course, reset means that reset is being triggered. So it's a temporary state here. Right. So how do we verify? Just to give you some idea, we specified all ETL properties in some SMB, symbolic model language. We convert the Verilog HDL, or in other words, the finite state machines, into SMV, and then we check whether the FSMs agree with specified linear temporal logic properties using something called the new SMV model checker. It's a publicly available tool. And yeah, and then completes. Of course, it's an iterative process. It's not something we do only once. We sometimes we do it multiple times because there are sometimes specification or implementation bugs. And then we actually realize this in a FPGA, right? And using something called, and one of the reasons we picked TI-MSP 430 is because of the availability of this toolkit called OpenMSP 430, okay? This was implemented on a basis 3 FPGA. So this is the real thing. This you can see in a picture. And RATA by itself isn't viable without attestation. So one thing I maybe should have made a little more clear is that RATA allows you to verify the state of the device first based on the value of LMT. So the verifier, when it gets back the token, the attestation token, will see whether the LMT has been modified, right? So the LMT does not somehow agree with the last time it legitimately performed attestation, or it legitimately modified the attested region. But then when the verifier finds that something bad has happened, it needs to actually perform the real attestation, that is, compute the actual cryptographic function over the entire memory, perhaps in order to determine what kind of malware has infected the prover. And so that requires the actual remote attestation architecture, which I did not talk about that much so far. But what we do here is build on top of something called VRAISD, or VRAISD, which is a previously proposed architecture that also comes out of my group and has been implemented also on the same platform. Okay, so essentially what RATA is an addition, kind of a tiny superstructure on top of a remote attestation scheme. In this case, VRAISD, but it could be any of the ones that I've mentioned earlier as examples. Okay, and the source code for this implementation is freely available. You can see the pointer here. Then moving right along, well, we perform some evaluation, of course, with any kind of architecture that requires hardware modifications on the prover side. It's important to measure the amount of overhead. And so typically with this kind of, with hardware modifications, there are two things one looks for: the increase in number of lookup tables and number of extra registers. And so this shows you the increase, and both VRAISD, already you can see it's marginally, the blue bar is marginally taller than the green bar, which is plain MSP 430 or Open MSP 430 toolkit. And RATA-A adds just a tiny bit on top of that, and RATA-B a little bit more. So the difference between, let's say, RATA-B and a virgin Open MSP 430 is a couple of % overhead. So RATA is actually not that important here, but if we focus on RATA-B, the overhead in terms of registers is under 5%, and the lookup tables under 4%. Okay, and although we don't formally prove it, we believe that this requirement, the extra hardware requirements, are minimal. Okay, and there's very little memory overhead. This is only like 256 bytes that, 256 bits that is introduced by RATA of extra memory requirement. Now we also compare with a couple of related schemes or alternative schemes. Let me take a minute here to zoom in on those. So I think it's safe to ignore RATA A because, again, it's not realistic. So let's focus on the green, the red, and the gray bars. So RATA B, as you see in the green, and that's its lookup tables and additional register overhead. We compare it to two alternative approaches, which is SAID and Erasmus. Both SAID and Erasmus are what's called self-attestation techniques that are also somewhat effective against TOCTOU attacks, because what they do is they assume that the prover on its own, without a explicit request of the verifier, that on some schedule, the prover on its own performs what's called self-attestation, that periodically computes its own cryptographic measurements of its own memory and stores those, okay? Or delivers them unilaterally to the verifier. And so that is an alternative way to deal with TOCTOU attacks, but as I mentioned earlier, it's not resource friendly because it requires the device to perform fairly frequent full-blown attestation, whereas in case of RATA, both A and B, this is avoided. Well, it's also not surprising, perhaps, that in terms of hardware overhead, this is RATA B at least is quite a bit lower. Finally, runtime overhead. I remind you that if you recall how I defined remote attestation, it requires this sort of computation of a cryptographic function like an HMAC or a CBC-based MAC over the entire memory. So the runtime or the overhead is linear with respect to memory size. Well, in RATA, the only thing that is attested initially is the LMT, which is a fixed length value. So clearly its overhead is constant, right? Unless something is wrong, right? So most of the time, nothing is wrong. There is no malware, there's no TOCTOU, there's no problem, right? Most of the time devices are not attacked. So computing attestation with RATA is constant overhead for the prover device, which means you cannot be less than that. But for others, it's linear, yeah? For the computation essentially. Now, in case something is wrong, that with RATA it detects that something has been modified, then a full-blown attestation takes place, and that of course depends on the overhead will depend on the memory size. So we're pretty much at the end, and where I was hoping to be at this point at 450. What are the takeaways from this work? Well, this is not rocket science. There's nothing exceedingly difficult or sophisticated in this work. It's pretty straightforward. But what the value that it provides is that it offers these two flavors, of which one, of course, is just for the show, RATA A, and RATA B is the more useful kind. These are formally verified remote attestation techniques that are provably secure against TOCTOU attacks, which has been an open problem in many contexts of security research, these TOCTOU attacks. And armed with RATA, remote attestation does not need to take a lot of time, right? Its cost is no longer dependent on memory size, which is great. And it uses quite a minimal amount of extra hardware, which is also good. And it can also be used as a building block to construct what we in this sort of topic call collective remote attestation protocols. This is essentially what happens when you have a multitude of identical devices. So think of a factory floor or a building, a large building, office building or whatever, where you have a large number of identical devices, where there are smart light bulbs or smart door locks, but there may be hundreds or thousands of those devices, and they all need to be attested at some point. And so if you attest them one by one, that's a lot of bandwidth and a lot of delay and a lot of computation. But collective array or collective remote attestation is essentially a way of attesting more efficiently a large number of identical devices. And so we believe that RATA B can be used in that context. So that's a subject of ongoing work. And then, of course, other attestation schemes, like I mentioned a few here, but they're like Apex, TinySif, and DAL can be used also together with RATA to significantly sort of reduce the overhead of remote attestation. And this brings me to the end. And if time permits, are there any questions?